Well, maybe to start with, just one of the things I was going to start off by saying is just wanted to congratulate the planning committee on the organisation of yesterday. I thought it went really, really well. I thought the introductory talks were both great. It was a shame that Julian wasn't able to be here with us, but actually I thought it worked really well. And the idea of having the Pechacuchas immediately after that, I thought it worked really well also, because it was immediately we got into some interactive stuff, and it was great to see people kind of working out how to do the slides and everything. It was fantastic. And then the more in-depth case studies. So I just thought yesterday yesterday went really well. And certainly my discussion group, or the discussion group I was part of, we had really interesting discussions on every time we met. So it generated lots of really good ideas and thoughts. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. And then I guess the other thing is where the task was to sort of summarize, present some thoughts on yesterday. And in a way, it seems pointless just to summarize what other people said, because you were all there. You all listened to those, and then we had a kind of hour's discussion after each topic. So I don't think I really need to summarize. So what I've done essentially is to just think a bit about some points that some themes that emerged from me that perhaps weren't as explicit as they might have been, and to try to make those a bit more explicit, and also to identify a few gaps, and also picking up a bit on Kevin's point about the importance of normativity and thinking about bioethics as a normative discipline, and what that might add, as it were, to some of these questions. So, okay, good. So this is, can I control? Yeah. So this is my presentation. So I was going to ask how many people in the room have heard of Elon Musk, but I'm assuming everyone's heard of Elon Musk. So Elon Musk and baked-in bioethics. I'll explain what I mean by both those things in a minute. Yeah, this doesn't. Oh, yeah. Okay. So the way I've kind of organised my thoughts around this, I haven't seen what time it is. I should check. Is around a series of essentially scales, and they don't really work perfectly or anything like that, but they're just kind of initial ideas, at least things to think about. Just put my stopwatch on. Okay. So I've got, I think, 4 scales that might, I think, hopefully capture some of the things we talked about yesterday, but also potentially offer some new ways, some new questions that we might be interested in. So the first is to do with thinking about the scale of the interventions that might be undertaken as research projects, as topics as interventions about which research might be done, or as interventions that may not, in fact, they perhaps ought to be considered from an ethical perspective, but may not end up being that. So I think, many of the things we heard about yesterday were relatively small-scale local interventions. There could be in a particular place, a very small place, or there could be at a national level or regional level. But essentially, they're small-scale interventions. And the one that I remembered when I was thinking about this was this idea of modifying agricultural practices. In this case, it was moving from maize to drought-resistant crops. So that's the kind of intervention about which research could be undertaken. And in a way, many of the questions there are bioethics questions are familiar in the kind of projects we heard about yesterday, or interventions. Then that doesn't mean they're easy. They're really difficult problems. The questions about engaging with communities, thinking about consent, thinking about risks and benefits, etc. Those are clearly really difficult problems, but they're familiar. They're problems we recognize. But I think one thing we didn't talk about yesterday is something I think is going to be really increasingly important in the context of climate change, which is large-scale, potentially planetary interventions. So I've been asked to be an ethics advisor recently on something called ARIA, which is the UK's version of sort of DARPA, these kind of adventurous money spending. So, the sorts of projects get talked about there are, can we change the weather? What can we do to do that? Is it possible to develop surveillance of Earth systems which will enable us to intervene? So these are kind of techno solutions, which won't be, and this is where Elon Musk comes in, because it seems highly likely to me that the sorts of things that happen are not going to go through IRBs. They're not going to be explicitly considered from an ethical perspective. They're going to be done by, or at least going to be developed by someone like Elon Musk, perhaps by, let's say, Chinese governments of, these are not necessarily entities that are going to go through ethics committees. So how do we think about that kind of ethics of interventions and potentially research on the planet? And these, I think, are really important, but not very familiar ways of thinking about bioethics. And I think we might need to develop some new methods for thinking about those problems. And it's a challenge. So the question that I'm left with when I think about that is it possible to develop a kind of bioethics which can be coherently scaled from the very local, small scale, to the very large planetary techno solution? And what are the methodological requirements for doing that kind of work? Do we need to? And maybe we have different ethics at different scales, but is it possible to scale? What are the methodological challenges, and what are the ethical challenges of doing ethics in that kind of way? So that was my first scale. The second scale is about shared values. So one of the things that came out yesterday, I think, was the importance of difference, which of course really is important. But one of the things I think didn't come out quite as much is the importance of shared values at all these different levels. So when we're talking, there was a strong emphasis in Julian's talk, but also in the rest of the day, on the idea of localization of climate change ethics and politics, the idea of regionalization and localization. But it was striking to me how much of that, whilst explicitly about difference, and the fact that things might be viewed differently or understood differently in different places by different knowledge practices, they were always in every case paired with this idea, this kind of call to common values. You know, we really need to be committed to justice, to equity, to inclusivity, to respect for local or indigenous knowledges. And those are values which I think we would hope would become shared in some way. So there's, on the one hand, a call for difference, but also a call to shared values. And of course, at the planetary level, global level, many of the problems of climate change, many of the problems of climate change are going to be essentially collective action problems. They're going to require countries and entities that are not countries to work together, find ways of collaborating against a background of quite big differences. So how are we going to do that? Well, somehow we need to find some shared values, or at least some shared goals, and find ways of working together, even if we don't agree. So shared values seem to be important, whether you think about this at the global level or at the local level. So one thing that we have in common wherever we find ourselves in that spectrum is this commitment to developing some shared values. So the question then, I guess, is to what extent can bioethics coherently both be scaled up and down, but also for that to be done in a way which can engage meaningfully both with differences of knowledge and value and the search for some shared value and some shared knowledge. And I'll come to disagreement in a minute, but it seems strikingly important to me that we engage not only with the science and these other forms of knowledge, but also with political philosophy, because we're not going to answer those questions unless we engage with that. Oh, that kind of jumped before I pressed the button. Anyway, so then my second scale is about disagreement and respect. One of the things that at the global level, I mean, I just mentioned it before, is, you know, if we're going to develop the kinds of collective action, the kind of shared values that are going to be necessary for engaging with climate change in a way that is effective, we're going to have to do that against the background of an increasingly polarized world, increasingly multipolar and polarized world, against the background of misinformation, fake news, and a crisis of what constitutes expertise. And certainly, at the very least, even if it's not a crisis, it's a context in which there are important differences about what constitutes relevant expertise. And we've been through some of that yesterday. And also, you know, huge changes in politics, a great deal of instability around political systems. So if we think about this at the global level, we're going to have to work towards agreement and shared values against the background of disagreement, and somehow find a way to do that in the context of something like respect, whatever that means at that level. But this is also true, I think, at the local level. It seems to me that any knowledge practice, any knowledge system is going to be characterized by false beliefs, persistent false beliefs, as much as persistent true beliefs. So, you know, what does one do when encounters an indigenous knowledge system which has as a core belief the fact that smoking is good for your health? How do you deal with that? It seems highly likely to me that there'll be many beliefs in wherever we go in the world, including all of our own locations, that there'll be beliefs that are actually just wrong. But it's also true that there's going to be, you know, the idea of deferring in some way to indigenous knowledge doesn't, as expressed in that kind of way, doesn't take into account the fact that indigenous knowledges are going to be in conflict with each other. And there'll be places where you have multiple indigenous communities. A place that comes to mind because I've just had a bit of experience is Papua New Guinea, for example, which is incredibly diverse. What one indigenous community thinks is going to be radically different to what the one on the other valley thinks. So how do you deal with that? So there are going to be false beliefs and there are going to be conflicts. So if we're thinking about the bioethics, what bioethics can do in that kind of context, it's going to have to be able to deal with difference at all these different levels and disagreement, and it's going to have to work out what constitutes respect in that kind of situation. So disagreement and radical value conflicts are persistent features of climate change ethics at all these levels, and I think we kind of underplayed that a bit yesterday, to be honest. But I don't think that critique is incompatible with respect. Actually, to be respectful, I think, of a knowledge system is to be able to engage in discussion which has a critical dimension to it. And if a knowledge system isn't open to the idea that some of the things it believes in might not be sustainable, then I think that's a reason for criticizing it. And then my final scale is a scale of co-production. So we've got this idea in one way of talking about this in bioethics is this Peter Singer's idea of the expanding circle of bioethics, where we kind of have over time become interested in the idea of paying attention to the interests of a wider circle of beings. And you can see that where that's gone in this kind of context, and with Peter Singer too, going from people to animals to the planet to some degree. So we said yesterday that we thought that co-production was key to doing our work. So does that imply an expanding circle of co-production or co-creation as well? So how does one think about that? If we go from co-production from wider and wider groups with wider and wider groups of humans, what does that mean in the context of non-humans? Does it mean potentially the possibility of some kind of co-production with animals? It's not. It strikes me that's not necessarily impossible, but one would have to think carefully about it. But if we did decide that that was impossible, then that suggests we might need to think about situations in which, as Ignacio was saying yesterday, the duties are all with humans. So what does that mean in this kind of situation? So again, there's a familiar bioethics and a less familiar bioethics there. Okay, and then my final slide, sorry Jantina, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm all right, not too bad, 10 minutes, that's fine. Coming back to the idea of baked-in bioethics. So in his introductory talk yesterday, Julian said something like, if we don't identify and address ethical issues, we risk baking in existing inequalities and structural injustices. And when I was thinking about that last night, I was thinking baking in, that's kind of a very, to me at least, that seems like a very English kind of concept. It may not be, but I did think, wonder if everyone knows what baking in means. But anyway, this idea that if we don't pay attention to these injustices at an early stage where new technologies or new ways of thinking are being formed, we end up potentially with a kind of slightly more solid cake like that, where the objects inside are less easy to manipulate and address and engage with. But I just wonder in the light of this, whether there's another formulation of this, which is to put it the other way around. So if we're really serious about identifying and addressing inequalities and structural injustice, we need to ensure that bioethics is actually baked in to climate change debates, policy and interventions from an early stage. But I think it's really important, my final point, to recognize that baking bioethics in means baking in respectful, critical engagement with conflict and radical value disagreement. So I think the idea of conflict and disagreement has to be really at the heart of any work that we do on climate change ethics. And I think we potentially underplay that because we're very keen, of course, for good reasons, to be inclusive and diverse. But I don't think that's incompatible with taking disagreement and critique seriously. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So unlike Mike, I didn't have the benefit of a sleepless night, so I have no slides. And unlike Mike, I had the benefit of his mind when I was doing my PhD. He was my PhD supervisor, so it's so cool to follow in his footsteps. So I also agree. I think I really enjoyed yesterday. I enjoyed our group discussions. I enjoyed the various presentations, and thank you to everyone who made that happen. I was left with a number of distinctions. Some of this, some of you will have heard before. Some of this might be quite new. The first kind of reflection that I wanted to share with you is, I was reminded of, was it Idris Shah who wrote a book called The Elephant in the Dark, where he spoke about the parable of an elephant and blind people, or people who are in a very dark room, feeling a different part of the elephant, right? And so what I was left with yesterday was thinking that many of these presentations that we were listening to had grabbed hold of a part of this elephant, right? So somebody was describing the tail, or maybe, you know, and thinking that it was like a brush to draw an image with. Somebody else was feeling the leg and thinking that what they had got hold of was maybe a table or something, I don't know. But somehow what I felt was missing was this kind of broader view of the project that is at stake. You know, what is this bioethics for the biosphere, which I think Tony asked us to, or provoked us to think about. What is that bioethics? And personally, I'm driven by a huge dissatisfaction with the way that the world is, but also the limited imagination that I find in the scholarship, in some of the scholarship in bioethics that gets produced. And I wish that we were much better at engaging with the elephant in its totality. And what I mean by that is, I think what we need is a radically different way of thinking about that bioethics of the biosphere. And I'll give you a bit of a sense of where I see these contours of this kind of different way of imagining bioethics emerging. So Kyle, yesterday in our group discussion, joked, Kyle, I hope you don't mind me drawing it out, and if I misheard you, my apologies. But I heard him say, the existing ethics guidelines are only sufficient if they require a political revolution. And I want a political revolution. I can't, the older I get, the less I'm satisfied with the absence of something that is bigger. Thank you, Tony. I see you nodding your head. And I miss that sense of urgency from our discussions. And there are people that are trying to do things really differently. And I keep on coming back, and some of you will have heard me say this already. I've been really inspired by a book that I read recently by somebody called Amitav Ghosh, who is an author originally from India, who wrote a book called The Nutmeg's Curse, where he speaks about a politics of vitality. And he says that what we need, the alternative that is in front of us, is a politics of vitality, and in fact an ethics of vitality that allows us to recognize the complete interdependence and interconnection of humans and the world around them. And the politics of vitality that he proposes recognizes nature not just as being interconnected, but nature itself as having agency. And I find that idea really provocative. I love the term as well. And so my question here is, what does that politics in the ethics of vitality look like? And how are we going to get there as a community of people thinking about and working in bioethics? And I was inspired by some of the talks yesterday that were, I think, starting to reveal what is possible in our imagination. And Wellister, your talk, I think, I was almost sorry that you didn't have more time to say more, because I was inspired by the possibility of thinking about a different way of relating to the world around us. And there are other people too. So I've spoken to some of you about a text that I read by somebody called Paula Ricaurte Quijano. She writes from Mexico. She wrote a wonderful paper called Ethics for the Majority World, where she speaks about the slow violence that is inflicted on the people, on many of the people whose interests should be at the heart of bioethics. And And there are others, right? Many people, especially people writing from the global south, have written about and started to articulate alternative ways in which we can think about our world. And what those people do consistently is some of these things. So the one thing that they tend to do is they tend to move away from dualities. So they tend to move away from thinking about the world in binaries, and start to recognize that actually a lot of what we need to think about is matters of gradation, right? There are no absolute separations between humans and nature, between logic, reason, and emotion, and so on and so forth. Those dualities, and Amitav Ghosh writes about this quite provocatively, have allowed us to live in this delusion that nature is inert and does not have agency, that the earth is mechanistic, right, and available for our use. That ethics has allowed this kind of system. And what I would wish to push us towards is to think differently. So how do we think differently? And how do we reckon and how do we bring into our analyses the slow violence that is inflicted on the poor, and the way in which precarity is a system that keeps poor people poor and vulnerable? And when I hear the presentations, what I'm not hearing is this kind of bringing the macro political into our micro political, analyses of situations and disasters. I've taken lots of notes, but I don't want to overwhelm you. So what does a centering of a different kind of ethics look like? And feminists have done this really well for quite a while. So there's lots of different people that have done work in this domain. But a feminist bioethics, for instance, is one that I'm perhaps a bit more familiar with. Requires a commitment to activism. Scholarship is never scholarship for its own sake. Scholarship is always engaged in the project of a better world, right? Another world is necessary should be our slogan, and we should drive towards it. And so recognizing activism or a commitment to activism, I think, characterizes the kind of scholarship that we need. It constitutes life-affirming practices. So a feminist bioethics squarely places front and center a commitment to life-affirming practices, both in how we do ethics, what working hours do we adopt, how do we operate, how do we relate to each other, but also what questions do we ask. It explicitly connects the personal to the political. That's not an accident in feminist bioethics. It's explicit and intentional. And so that needs to be part, I think, of the kind of ethics that we pursue. And it's premised on practices of care and solidarity. So it asks provocative questions about what happens when we center our institutions and design our institutions around care, not just for ourselves, not just for other humans, but care for the environment and care for the planet as well. What happens when we think about solidarity and we extend solidarity to the planet, right? So we don't just think about solidarity between people, but we think about planetary solidarity as a concept that guides us. So that's my desire, right? That is what I think should be, what the elephant is that we should be speaking about. Now, the other observation I wanted to make, or the other point of reflection, is that in that work of imagining something different, our engagement with different ideas cannot be only or merely tokenistic. So indigenous worldviews, and again, Tony, I think you made this point yesterday, and I want to just kind of resurface it in our discussions, requires a complete and radical overhaul of everything that we know and imagine the world to be. It is not tokenistic, and it is not instrumental. So these worldviews, feminists, indigenous, decolonial worldviews, these theorists have all proposed radical new ways of imagining the world around us. And that means we need to change as much as our institutions need to change. So these complex ideas can simply not and must not be instrumentalized to validate pre-existing ideas about the world. And so the caution that I want to bring to us today is to be really self-critical about what it is that we are trying to do when we invoke an indigenous perspective, for instance. I heard epistemic justice in many of the talks yesterday, but nobody defined it. What do we mean when we say epistemic justice? What are we aspiring to? What claim are we making about knowledge, about the process of knowledge production, and about the kind of outcome that we aspire to? Right? So what does that mean to us? What does social justice mean for us? How do we invoke it? What is our imagined better world, the better future that we would like to work towards? And then similarly, methodological rigor, I think, is equally important. So I've spoken about conceptual rigor, being really clear about what it is that we invoke, that we use, the concepts that we use, but also what methodological implications do these methods have for us? So when we work in a feminist tradition, for instance, or when we work in a tradition of co-creation, that requires particular things. It confers upon us particular kinds of obligations towards the people that we involve in our research projects. And those are undeniable. We cannot simply use a method and not recognize the kinds of ethical obligations that the method places on us. So for instance, providing the basic needs. If you cannot meet the basic necessities of the people that are involved in your research, you ought not probably do that research, right? Or you need to have imagined it differently. And so how do we think about that, and how do we bring methodological rigor to the work that we do, I think is really important. So those are my two cents worth. Cool.